The rusted padlock on the barn door had been broken for 3 weeks, but Maya Chun had only just discovered it tonight. Rain hammered against the weathered wooden walls as she pressed herself deeper into the corner behind the hay bales, clutching a backpack that contained everything she owned in the world. She was 17 years old, soaking wet, and more afraid than she'd ever been in her life. What Maya didn't know was that the man who owned this barn, and the thousands of acres surrounding it, was at that very moment walking through the storm, toward the same shelter she'd chosen, carrying his own burdens and secrets that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The highway patrol officer had been following Maya Chun for 3 miles before she realized the flashing lights were meant for her. Not that it mattered. Her foster father's 1998 Honda Civic had been running on fumes in desperation for the last 50 miles. And when the engine finally seized up in a cloud of white smoke just outside Flagstaff, Arizona, Maya knew her luck had officially run out. She'd abandoned the car on the shoulder of Highway 89, grabbing her backpack and starting to walk into the desert darkness without looking back. The officer had called after her, his voice swallowed by wind and the sound of 18-wheelers roaring past. But Maya had learned long ago that running toward authority figures rarely improved her situation. So she'd kept walking, following a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere, until the storm caught her. Now, 3 hours later, she was breaking into someone's barn like the criminal everyone had always told her she'd become. Maya pressed her face against the gap between 2 hay bales and peered out into the darkness. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, terrifying bursts, endless rolling hills covered in sagebrush and juniper trees, interrupted by massive red rock formations that looked like sleeping giants. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, so different from the strip malls and concrete of Phoenix where she'd spent the last 2 years bouncing between foster homes. The storm was getting worse. Thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire, and the barn's tin roof sang with the percussion of hail mixed with rain. Maya pulled her knees to her chest and tried to make herself smaller, a skill she'd perfected over years of trying to become invisible whenever adults started making decisions about her future. She was supposed to be in Albuquerque by now, starting her new life as an emancipated minor with a job at a diner and a studio apartment above a laundromat. It wasn't much, but it was hers, the first thing that would ever truly belong to her since her grandmother died when Maya was 12. 5 years of foster care had taught her not to get attached to places or people, because both were temporary for kids like her, but the Honda's engine had other plans. And now Maya was stranded in the middle of nowhere with $43, a soggy peanut butter sandwich, and the growing realization that her carefully constructed escape plan was falling apart. The barn smelled like hay and motor oil, with an underlying scent of something she couldn't identify: sage, maybe, or cedar. It was surprisingly organized for an abandoned building. Tools hung on pegboard walls with the precision of someone who took care of their belongings. A workbench held projects in various stages of completion. What looked like jewelry made from turquoise and silver, pieces so beautiful that Maya found herself staring despite her fear. She hadn't intended to run away. Not exactly. The decision had crystallized 3 days ago when her current foster mother, Linda Morrison, had sat Maya down for another one of their talks about Maya's attitude problem and lack of gratitude for everything the Morrison family had done for her. "You're 17 now," Linda had said, arranging her face into the expression of patient concern that Maya had learned to distrust completely. "In 8 months, you'll age out of the system anyway. Don't you think it's time to start thinking about your future realistically?" Maya had nodded and made appropriate responses while internally calculating how much money she'd saved from her part-time job at the grocery store, how far it might get her, and whether she could survive on her own better than she was surviving. In a house where she'd never be more than a temporary inconvenience, the final straw had come when she'd overheard Linda on the phone with the caseworker, discussing Maya's behavioral issues and the possibility of moving her to a group home for her remaining months in care. Maya had heard enough conversations about herself to recognize the tone adults making decisions about her life without considering that she might have opinions about her own future. So she'd packed her backpack, left a note saying she was sorry for being more trouble than she was worth, and driven until the car died. Now she was a runaway, technically a criminal, hiding in someone's barn and trying not to think about what would happen when they found her. Because they always found her, eventually. Maya pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. No signal, which was both relief and terror. Relief because it meant no one could track her location. Terror because it meant she was truly on her own. In the middle of a storm that sounded like it was trying to tear the world apart, the barn door rattled suddenly, and Maya's heart stopped. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, barely breathing, as footsteps approached across the gravel. Outside. Heavy boots, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged here. The door opened with a creak of hinges, and Maya caught a glimpse of a figure silhouetted against the lightning tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a cowboy hat. The person stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind them, shutting out the storm's fury. Maya held her breath and tried to become one with the hay bales. She could hear the person moving around the barn, their footsteps echoing in. The sudden quiet. A flashlight beam swept across the walls, briefly illuminating the jewelry workbench, a set of saddles hung on wooden stands, and a collection of what looked like Native American artifacts arranged on shelves. "I know you're in here," a voice said quietly. Maya's blood turned to ice water. The voice was male, older, with a slight accent she couldn't place. Not threatening, exactly, but calm in a way that suggested he was used to finding unexpected visitors in his barn. "The rain's been washing out the road for the last hour," the voice continued. "Saw your tracks leading up from the highway. Figure. You're probably cold and scared, and maybe running from something that seems worse than a stranger's barn." Maya squeezed her eyes shut and tried to make herself disappear. In her experience, strange men who found teenage girls hiding in isolated places rarely had good intentions, regardless of how reasonable they sounded. "I'm going to turn on the lights," the voice said. "Don't run. You'll just get wet again, and that storm's not going to quit until morning." The barn flooded with warm yellow light from several hanging fixtures, and Maya found herself staring at a man who wasn't quite what she'd expected. He was probably in his 40s, with weathered brown skin and black hair touched with silver at the temples. His clothes, work jeans, flannel shirt, worn leather boots, suggested a rancher or farmer, but there was something in his posture and the way he held himself that spoke of education and authority. Most surprising were his eyes. Maya had developed a survival instinct for reading adult expressions, categorizing them into safe, dangerous, or unpredictable. This man's eyes held something she rarely encountered: genuine concern, without any underlying agenda that she could detect. "My name is Thomas Beay," he said, making no move to approach her hiding spot. "This is my barn, and you're welcome to stay until the storm passes." Maya remained frozen, calculating distances to possible exits and the likelihood that she could outrun him if necessary. Thomas Beay seemed to understand her fear because he sat down on a hay bale about 10 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to give her space. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said simply. "And I'm not going to call anyone unless you want me to. But you look like you could use some dry clothes and a hot meal." Maya's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, reminding her that the soggy peanut butter sandwich was the only thing she'd eaten since yesterday morning. Thomas smiled, not the predatory smile that set off alarm bells, but something warmer and more genuine. "When's the last time you ate something?" he asked. "I'm fine." Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sure you are. But being fine doesn't mean you can't be hungry at the same time." Thomas glanced toward the workbench where the turquoise jewelry was displayed. "I was working late when the storm hit. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I come out here and make things. With my hands, helps quiet the mind." Despite her fear, Maya found herself curious about the jewelry. Up close, she could see that each piece was unique, incorporating stones and metals in patterns that seemed to tell stories. "You made those?" she asked. "My grandmother taught me when I was about your age. Said working with turquoise and silver was a way of staying connected to the earth and to our ancestors." Thomas picked up one of the unfinished pieces, a bracelet with intricate silverwork surrounding a piece of turquoise the color of summer sky. "She used to say that every stone has a story, and the jeweler's job is to help tell it." Maya found herself drawn into the conversation, despite every instinct telling her to remain silent and invisible. There was something hypnotic about the way Thomas spoke, without pressure or expectation, just sharing information like he might with any interested visitor. "Are you Navajo?" she asked, remembering fragments of Arizona history from school. "Dine," Thomas corrected gently. "That's what we call ourselves. Navajo is what other people call us." Maya nodded, filing away this information. In foster care, she'd learned that understanding people's preferred names and identities was often the difference between acceptance and rejection. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. Maya hesitated. Giving him her real name felt like surrendering some essential piece of her independence. But something about Thomas Beay made lying seem unnecessary and exhausting. "Maya Chun," she said finally. "Maya, that's a beautiful name. How old are you, Maya?" 17. Then, because she'd learned that volunteering information sometimes prevented more invasive questions, she added, "I'll be 18 in 4 months." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Running away or running to something? The question caught Maya off guard with its directness and lack of judgment. Adults usually asked why she was running, implying that her reasons were probably insufficient. Thomas was asking about direction and intention, treating her like someone capable of making purposeful decisions about her own life. "Both, I guess," Maya admitted. "That's honest. Takes courage to run towards something unknown." Thomas set down the bracelet he'd been holding and looked directly at Maya. "You planning to stay in this area or just passing through?" Maya realized she hadn't thought beyond escaping Phoenix. Her plan had been to get to Albuquerque, but that was before the car died and left her stranded in what felt like the middle of nowhere. "I don't know," she said honestly. "My car broke down on the highway. I was walking and saw your barn when the storm hit." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Maya could see him processing this information. She braced herself for the inevitable lecture about the dangers of hitchhiking or walking alone in the desert, the offer to call her parents or the police, the assumption that she was too young and too stupid to know what was best for herself. Instead, Thomas said, "Car trouble's fixable. The question is whether you want it fixed so you can keep going, or whether you might be interested in staying put for a while." Maya stared at him, confused by this response. "What do you mean?" "I mean this valley could use someone young and capable who's not afraid of hard work. And you look like someone who knows how to work." It was such an unexpected offer that Maya didn't know how to respond. Adults didn't usually look at her and see capability. They saw a problem to be managed, a burden to be endured until she aged out of their responsibility. "I don't know anything about ranching," Maya said carefully. Thomas smiled. "Neither did when I came back here 15 years ago. But the land teaches you what you need to know if you're willing to listen." The storm was beginning to quiet outside, the thunder moving farther away across the valley. Maya realized that her fear had gradually been replaced by curiosity. Thomas Beay wasn't like any adult she'd encountered in the foster care system. He spoke to her like she was a person with agency and intelligence, rather than a collection of problems that needed solving. "Why would you offer work to someone you just met hiding in your barn?" Maya asked. Thomas considered this question seriously. "Because I know something about running away from places that don't feel like home. And because this land has room for people who need a fresh start." Maya felt tears threatening, which surprised her. She'd thought she'd cried out all her tears during the long drive from Phoenix. But something about Thomas's words, the acknowledgement that she needed a fresh start rather than fixing, touched a part of her that had been carefully protected. "For years, I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. "Then maybe this is where you're supposed to be," Thomas said simply. As the storm finally began to clear, Maya Chun realized that her broken-down car and desperate flight from Phoenix might not have been a disaster after all. Maybe they'd been the first steps towards something she'd never allowed herself to hope for, a place where she might actually belong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya woke to the sound of birds she'd never heard before, not the harsh cawing of city crows or the shrill chirping of sparrows fighting over McDonald's scraps, but something melodic and complex, like a conversation between old friends. Sunlight streamed through a window she didn't remember, illuminating walls made of honey-colored wood and adorned with weavings and patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back: the storm, the barn, Thomas Beay's unexpected kindness. After their conversation, he'd led her through the rain to his house, a low adobe structure that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself. He'd shown her to a guest room, handed her a stack of clean towels and a set of clothes that belonged to his niece, and told her they'd figure everything else out in the morning. Maya had expected to lie awake all night, hyper-vigilant and ready to run at the first sign of danger. Instead, she'd fallen into the deepest sleep she'd experienced in years, her body finally relaxing in a space that felt genuinely safe. Now, wearing borrowed jeans and a soft cotton t-shirt that actually fit, Maya ventured out of the guest room to find Thomas in his kitchen, preparing what looked like enough breakfast to feed a small army. The kitchen was unlike anything she'd seen in foster homes, spacious but warm, with copper pots hanging from hand-forged hooks and windows that framed the desert landscape like living paintings. "Good morning," Thomas said without turning around. "Hope you like eggs. I may have gotten a little carried away." Maya approached cautiously, still not entirely convinced that this hospitality didn't come with strings attached. On the counter, she could see scrambled eggs mixed with what looked like green chiles, thick strips of bacon, fresh tortillas warming on a griddle, and fruit she couldn't identify cut into perfect segments. "You didn't have to do all this," Maya sighed. "Cooking for one gets boring after a while," Thomas replied, finally turning to face her. In daylight, Maya could see details she'd missed in the barn: the laugh lines around his eyes, the careful way he moved that suggested old injuries, the turquoise bracelet on his left wrist that matched the stones in his jewelry collection. "Besides, we have things to discuss." Maya's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Adults always had things to discuss, and those discussions rarely ended well for her. She perched on the edge of a chair at the kitchen table, ready to bolt if necessary. Thomas seemed to sense her tension because he sat down across from her before saying anything else, making himself less physically imposing. "Relax, Maya. I'm not going to lecture you or make decisions for you. I just thought you might want to know where you ended up." He gestured toward the windows, where the morning light was revealing a landscape that took Maya's breath away. Rolling hills covered in grass that looked almost golden in the sunrise, interrupted by red rock formations and stands of trees she couldn't name. In the distance, mountains rose like purple shadows against a sky so blue it looked painted. "This valley," Thomas said, following her gaze, has been in my family for more generations than anyone can count. My great-great-grandfather received it as part of a treaty agreement in 1868, when the government was trying to convince our people to stay in one place instead of following the seasons. Maya found herself leaning forward, caught up in the story. Despite her usual defensiveness around adult attempts at connection, the original grant was for 640 acres, Thomas continued. But over the years, my family managed to buy the surrounding land whenever it came up for sale. My grandfather was particularly good at acquiring property from ranchers who couldn't make their payments during the Depression. How much land is it now? Maya asked. Thomas smiled. 12,000 acres. Roughly 18 square miles. Maya stared at him, trying to process this information. 18 square miles meant that everything she could see from the kitchen windows, the hills, the rock formations, the distant mountains belonged to Thomas Beay. She'd been thinking of him as a rancher with a barn and maybe a few dozen acres. She hadn't realized she'd stumbled onto what amounted to a private kingdom. What do you do with all that land? She asked. Cattle ranching mostly. About 800 head of cattle spread across the grazing areas. Some horse breeding. We specialize in paint horses with bloodlines that go back to the animals my ancestors rode. And lately, I've been developing part of the property for sustainable tourism. Thomas got up to serve breakfast, piling eggs and bacon onto plates with the casual confidence of someone who'd been feeding people for years. Maya found herself eating before she consciously decided to trust the food, her body making decisions. Her mind wasn't ready for sustainable tourism. She asked between bites of the best scrambled egg she'd ever tasted. City people who want to experience authentic native culture and pristine desert wilderness. We offer horseback riding, traditional camping experiences, guidance for hiking and rock climbing. The kind of things that help people remember they're part of something larger than themselves. Maya nodded, though she had no frame of reference for the kind of tourism Thomas was describing. Her experience with nature had been limited to the occasional school field trip and the terrifying walk through the desert the night before. The business has been growing faster than I expected, Thomas continued, which is good for the local economy, but it means I need more help. Someone to assist with the horses, maintain the trails, help guests who've never been outside a city learn how to exist in the desert without getting themselves killed. Maya realized where this conversation was heading, and her chest tightened with a mixture of hope and terror. Adults had made her promises before promises that invariably came with conditions she couldn't meet or expectations she couldn't fulfill. Thomas, she said carefully, I appreciate what you did for me last night, and I appreciate breakfast, but I need you to know that I'm not good at staying places. People always start out being nice, and then they change their minds when they realize I'm more work than I'm worth. Thomas set down his coffee cup and studied Maya's face with the kind of attention that made her feel simultaneously exposed and understood. What makes you think you're more work than you're worth? The question caught Maya off guard. In 5 years of foster care, no one had ever asked her to examine the beliefs that shaped her self-perception. They'd simply accepted her assessment of herself as accurate and worked around it. Because that's what people always figure out eventually, Maya said. I have trust issues, and I don't like being told what to do, and I ask too many questions. I make people uncomfortable because I don't act grateful enough for things I didn't ask for. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression growing more thoughtful rather than defensive or dismissive. When Maya finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Maya, he said finally, everything you just described sounds like someone who's learned to protect herself in situations where she couldn't trust the adults who were supposed to take care of her. Those aren't character flaws. Those are survival skills. Maya felt tears threatening again. She'd spent years being told that her defensive behaviors were problems to be corrected rather than adaptations to circumstances beyond her control. Question isn't whether you're worth the work, Thomas continued. The question is whether this place might offer you something worth staying for. Maya looked out the windows again, taking in the vastness of the landscape that apparently belonged to the man sitting across from her. 12,000 acres of space where she could disappear if she needed to, but also space where she might be able to breathe without constantly watching for threats. What would I have to do? She asked. Learn, Thomas said simply. Learn how? To work with horses, how to read weather patterns, how to navigate desert terrain safely. Learn about the plants and animals that live here, the history of the land, the traditions my people have developed for living in harmony with this environment. And in exchange, room and board, a salary that's fair for the work you do, and time to figure out who you want to become when you're not spending all your energy just surviving. Maya realized that Thomas was offering her something no one had ever offered before. Opportunity to build a life based on her own choices rather than other people's emergency plans for what to do with her. How do I know you won't change? Your mind? She asked. How do I know you won't decide I'm too much trouble and kick me out? Thomas considered this question seriously. You don't know that, he said honestly. And I don't know that you won't decide this life isn't what you want and leave without warning. But Maya, uncertainty isn't the same as inevitability. Just because things have ended badly before doesn't mean they have to end badly this time. Maya found herself nodding, recognizing the wisdom in Thomas's words even as her survival instincts screamed warnings about trusting anyone who seemed too good to be true. There's something else you should know, Thomas said. This valley isn't just a ranch or a business. It's a sanctuary for people who need space to heal. I've had other young people work here over the years, kids aging out of foster care, young adults recovering from addiction, people transitioning out of military service who needed time to adjust to civilian life. What happened to them? Maya asked. Some stayed and built lives here. Some moved on to other things when they were ready. All of them left knowing more about themselves than when they arrived. Thomas stood up and walked to a window that faced east toward the mountains. My grandmother used to say that the land chooses its people as much as people choose the land. She believed that everyone who ended up here was supposed to be here, even if they didn't understand why yet. Maya joined him at the window, studying the landscape that might become her home. In the distance, she could see movement horses grazing. In a pasture, cattle gathered around a water source, birds circling high overhead. It was a world in constant motion, but peaceful motion, the kind of activity that suggested life being lived rather than merely survived. When would I start? Maya asked. Thomas smiled. How about right now? The horses need to be fed, and there's a group of tourists arriving this afternoon for a 3-day camping experience. You can observe today, start participating tomorrow. Maya felt a flutter of excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. Not the desperate hope that characterized her previous attempts to find belonging, but genuine curiosity about what she might be capable of in this new environment. Okay, she said, but Thomas, yes, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to ask questions that might seem obvious to you. And I'm going to need time to trust that this is real. Thomas nodded. Maya, I'd be worried if you didn't need those things. Anyone who survived what you've survived deserves time to believe in good things again. As they prepared to leave the house and begin Maya's introduction to life in the valley, Thomas handed her a water bottle and a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly belonged to someone else before her. One more thing, he said as they walked toward the barn where Maya had spent her first night. Out here, we measure success differently than the rest of the world. It's not about being perfect or never failing. It's about showing up consistently, learning from mistakes, and taking care of each other and the land. Think you can handle that? Maya settled the hat on her head and looked out across the 12,000 acres that might become her world. For the first time in years, she felt like she was walking toward something instead of running away from it. I can try, she said, and for Thomas Beay, who'd spent 15 years building a sanctuary for broken spirits. That was more than enough to begin with. Maya's first week in the valley nearly broke her. 3 times. The work itself wasn't what overwhelmed. Her feeding horses, mucking stalls, and maintaining fence lines were physically demanding but straightforward. What nearly sent her running back to the highway was the complete absence of the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in foster care for 5 years. In Thomas's world, there were no hidden agendas to decode, no emotional landmines to navigate, no adults whose moods shifted without warning based on factors completely outside Maya's control. There was just work to be done, lessons to be learned, and a kind of peace that felt foreign and unsettling. The horses were her first teachers in this new language of trust. "Horses don't lie," Thomas explained on her second morning as they approached the pasture where a dozen paint horses grazed in the early light. "They don't pretend to feel something they don't feel, and they don't hide their intentions. If you're nervous, they'll know. If you're angry, they'll respond accordingly. But if you're calm and honest, they'll work with you." Maya watched Thomas approach a large stallion with distinctive black and white markings. The horse lifted his head and moved toward Thomas without hesitation, accepting the halter with the ease of long familiarity. "This is Stormwalker," Thomas said, running his hand along the horse's neck. "He's our lead stallion, and he's got opinions about everything. Stormwalker, meet Maya." The horse turned his attention to Maya, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to see through every defense she'd ever constructed. Maya had been around animals before foster families, sometimes had pets, but never anything this large or this intelligent. "Give me your hand," Thomas said. Maya hesitated. In her experience, extending her hand toward anything usually resulted in pain or disappointment. "He wants to know your scent," Thomas explained. "Horses introduce themselves through smell and touch. It's their way of deciding whether you're trustworthy." Maya slowly extended her hand, palm up, toward Stormwalker's muzzle. The horse sniffed carefully, his breath warm against her skin, then gently touched her palm with his nose. It was the first time in years that Maya had been touched by another living creature without flinching. "He likes you," Thomas observed. "Stormwalker doesn't usually warm up to strangers this quickly." Maya found herself smiling, a genuine expression that felt strange on her face. "How can you tell? See how his ears are forward? How he's not backing away or showing any tension? He's decided you're interesting rather than threatening." Over the following days, Maya discovered that working with horses required a level of present-moment awareness she'd never developed. She couldn't hide behind sarcasm or emotional walls because the animals responded to what she was actually feeling rather than what she was pretending to feel. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Luna, a gentle mare with silver-gray markings, became Maya's first real responsibility. Thomas assigned her the daily care of this horse: feeding, grooming, exercise, and basic training. At first, Maya approached these tasks with the grimly determined efficiency she'd learned in foster homes, where completing chores quickly and without complaint was the best strategy for avoiding conflict. Luna responded to Maya's emotional state rather than her task completion rate. When Maya was tense and rushing, Luna became skittish and uncooperative. When Maya forced herself to slow down and focus on the relationship rather than the checklist, Luna transformed into a willing partner. "She's teaching you something important," Thomas observed one morning as he watched Maya brush Luna's coat with patient, circular strokes. "What's that?" "That care given from obligation feels different than care given from connection. Luna knows the difference, even if you're still figuring it out." Maya paused in her brushing, considering Thomas's words. In foster care, she'd learned to view care as transactional. Adults provided basic necessities in exchange for compliance and gratitude. The idea that care could be offered freely, without strings or expectations, was a concept she was still learning to trust, The tourist groups that visited the ranch provided Maya with a crash course in hospitality and cultural education. Thomas had built a reputation for offering authentic experiences that respected both his heritage and his guests' desire for adventure. He led trail rides through the most scenic parts of the valley, shared traditional stories around evening campfires, and taught basic survival skills that connected people to the land. In meaningful ways, Maya's role was initially limited to supporting activities, ensuring horses were properly saddled, helping guests mount and dismount safely, assisting with meal preparation and cleanup. But Thomas quickly recognized that her natural observational skills and genuine curiosity made her valuable in unexpected ways. "That woman in the red jacket," Thomas said quietly during Maya's first guided tour, nodding toward a guest who was struggling to control her horse. "What do you notice about her?" Maya studied the woman, probably in her 50s, well-dressed even in ranch clothes, sitting rigidly in her saddle with obvious tension. "She's scared," Maya said. "But she doesn't want anyone to know she's scared, so she's trying to force the horse to cooperate instead of relaxing and letting him help her." "Exactly. What would you do?" Maya considered this. In foster homes, she'd learned to recognize when adults were operating from fear disguised as control, when their harsh behavior was actually anxiety about their own competence. "I'd probably tell her something that lets her admit she's nervous, without feeling embarrassed about it." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Go ahead." Maya rode up beside the woman, matching her pace. "The first time I got on a horse," Maya said conversationally, "I was so nervous I couldn't stop gripping the reins. My instructor told me that horses can feel tension through their legs and hands, so the tighter I held on, the more anxious my horse became. It was like we were feeding each other's fear instead of helping each other feel safe." The woman looked at Maya with surprise and relief. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I've taken riding lessons before, but this feels completely different." "Desert horses are different from arena horses," Maya explained, surprised by her own confidence. "They're more independent, and they expect you to trust their judgment about terrain and weather. Maybe try loosening your grip and letting him choose his footing." Maya watched the woman consciously relax her hands and shoulders. Immediately, her horse's gait smoothed and his head lowered, signs of increased comfort and cooperation. "That's amazing," the woman said. "How did you know that would work?" Maya glanced at Thomas, who was watching their interaction with obvious satisfaction. "I guess I know something about what it feels like when people try to control you because they're afraid," Maya said. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is prove you're trustworthy, and then give them space to make their own choices." That evening, as the tourist group gathered around the campfire for Thomas's traditional storytelling session, Maya found herself included in the circle rather than working behind the scenes. She listened to Thomas share legends about the formation of the red rocks, about the relationship between his people and the land, about the importance of understanding yourself as part of an ecosystem rather than separate from it. But what struck Maya most was how the guests responded to these stories. City people who'd arrived talking about their stressful jobs and complicated relationships gradually relaxed into something approaching wonder. They asked thoughtful questions, shared their own stories about feeling disconnected from nature, and expressed genuine appreciation for the knowledge Thomas was sharing. "Why do people pay to come out here and learn about your culture?" Maya asked Thomas later as they cleaned up the campsite. Thomas considered her question while he banked the fire for the night. "Because most people have lost their connection to the things that actually matter: the land, the seasons, their own capacity for stillness and reflection. They come here because they've forgotten how to be present in their own lives." Maya understood this immediately. She'd spent years feeling like she was watching her life from outside her body, like an observer rather than a participant in her own experience. "Does it work?" she asked. "Do people actually change from spending 3 days here?" "Some do. They go back to their cities with a different understanding of what they need to be happy. Others don't change at all, but they have a few days of peace, which is worth something too. Maya nodded, beginning to understand that Thomas had built something more complex than a business. He'd created a space where transformation was possible but not required, where people could encounter versions of themselves they'd forgotten existed. Her third week brought Maya's first real test of whether she could stay in one place when things became difficult. A family from Denver arrived for a weekend experience. Parents in their 40s with 2 teenage children who clearly didn't want to be there. The father, Robert Williams, treated the horses like vehicles and the land like a commodity to be consumed. The mother, Patricia, spent most of her time taking selfies instead of engaging with the environment. But it was their 15-year-old son, Kyle, who triggered Maya's defensive instincts. Kyle reminded Maya of herself at that age, angry, guarded, convinced that adults were either incompetent or manipulative. He criticized everything about the ranch experience, questioned Thomas's knowledge with obvious disrespect, and made jokes about playing Indian that revealed both ignorance and malice. Maya watched Thomas respond to Kyle's hostility with patient humor, never taking the bait, never escalating the conflict. But she could see the teenager's behavior was wearing on Thomas, particularly when Kyle made comments about Native people that crossed the line from ignorant to offensive. On the second day, while Thomas was leading the parents on a horseback tour of the valley's geological features, Maya found herself alone with Kyle and his younger sister Emma near the horse corral. Emma was quietly sketching the horses in a notebook while Kyle threw rocks at fence posts and complained about the lack of cell phone service. "This place is so boring," Kyle announced to no one in particular. "There's literally nothing to do here. I don't know why my parents thought paying some Indian guy to play cowboys would be fun." Maya felt anger rise in her chest, not the cold, calculating anger she'd perfected in foster care, but something hotter and more protective. Someone was disrespecting Thomas, this place, and everything they'd given her. "His name is Thomas Beay," Maya said quietly. "He's Dine, not Indian. And he owns 18 square miles of some of the most beautiful land in Arizona." Kyle looked at Maya with surprise, apparently not expecting to be challenged by someone he'd assumed was just hired help. "Whatever," Kyle said. "It's still the middle of nowhere. There's no internet, no restaurants, no mall, no movie theaters. What do people actually do here?" Maya realized that Kyle's complaints weren't really about the ranch. They were about feeling disconnected from everything familiar, about being forced into an experience he hadn't chosen, about the discomfort of confronting a way of life that challenged his assumptions about what mattered. "They learn things," Maya said. "They learn how to be quiet enough to hear what the land is telling them. They learn that they don't need constant entertainment to be happy. They learn that there are different ways to measure whether your life is successful." Kyle stared at Maya with obvious skepticism. "And you believe that?" Maya considered his question seriously. 3 weeks ago, she would have agreed with Kyle completely. The valley would have seemed like exile rather than sanctuary, isolation rather than peace. "I'm starting to," Maya said honestly. "I'm starting to think that maybe the problem isn't that there's nothing to do here. Maybe the problem is that we've forgotten how to be somewhere without needing to be constantly stimulated and distracted." Emma looked up from her sketching with sudden interest. "Maya's right," she said quietly. "I've drawn more pictures here in 2 days than I drew all last month at home. It's like my brain works differently when it's not being interrupted every 5 minutes." Kyle looked between Maya and his sister, clearly processing their perspectives. Maya could see him struggling between his defensive cynicism and genuine curiosity about this alternative way of experiencing the world. "What's the point of being quiet and drawing pictures?" Kyle asked, but his tone had shifted from hostile to genuinely questioning. Maya thought about her answer carefully. "Maybe the point is learning who you are when you're not performing for other people or trying to prove something." Maybe the point is discovering what you actually care about when you're not being told what to care about. It was the most honest thing Maya had said to anyone since arriving in the valley, and she realized that her words were as much for herself as for Kyle. She was beginning to understand that Thomas had offered her something more valuable than employment. He'd offered her the space to discover who she might become when she wasn't spending all her energy just surviving. Maya discovered Thomas's workshop by accident on a Tuesday afternoon when the desert wind was howling through the valley with unusual fury. She'd been searching for a tool to repair a damaged gate latch when she noticed a door she'd never seen open before. Tucked behind the main barn in a building that looked older than everything else on the property, the workshop was a revelation. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with silver ingots, sheets of copper, and stones in every shade of blue and green imaginable. But it wasn't just jewelry being crafted here. Maya found herself staring at sculptures, ceremonial objects, and artwork that seemed to capture the essence of the desert itself in metal and stone. "You're not supposed to be in here." Maya spun around to find Thomas standing in the doorway, but his expression wasn't angry. If anything, he looked resigned, like someone whose secret had finally been discovered and who wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or exposed. "I'm sorry," Maya said quickly. "I was looking for a wire cutter and the door was open, and It's fine," Thomas said, stepping into the workshop and closing the door behind him. "I suppose it was inevitable that you'd find this place eventually." Maya gestured toward the incredible array of artwork surrounding them. "Thomas, this is amazing. Why didn't you tell me you were an artist?" Thomas moved to one of the workbenches and picked up a piece Maya hadn't noticed, a silver bracelet inlaid with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story in symbols she couldn't read. "Because most people don't understand the difference between art and cultural preservation," he said quietly. "They see Native American jewelry and think tourist souvenir instead of sacred tradition." Maya studied the bracelet Thomas was holding, recognizing that she was looking at something far more significant than decorative metalwork. The patterns were complex and purposeful, clearly carrying meaning that went beyond aesthetic appeal. "This is your family's heritage," Maya said, understanding dawning. "My grandmother's designs, passed down through 4 generations. Each pattern tells a story about our relationship to the land, to the seasons, to the spiritual world that exists alongside the physical one." Thomas set the bracelet down carefully. "When I came back to the valley 15 years ago, I thought I'd lost this knowledge forever. I'd spent 20 years in cities, getting educated, building a career, convincing myself that I could exist in the modern world without staying connected to my roots." Maya sensed that Thomas was sharing something he rarely discussed, and she found herself leaning forward with the focused attention she'd once reserved for survival information. "What changed?" she asked. Thomas walked to a shelf that held what appeared to be photographs, selecting one and handing it to Maya. The image showed a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing traditional dress and holding a piece of jewelry identical to the bracelet Thomas had just been examining. "My grandmother, Sarah Beay. She died while I was living in Chicago, working as an investment banker and thinking I was too sophisticated for reservation life." Thomas's voice carried a weight that Maya recognized, the particular regret that came from realizing you'd wasted time that couldn't be recovered. "She left me everything, the land, the house, the workshop, and boxes of jewelry designs that represented centuries of family knowledge. But she also left me a letter." Thomas moved to an old wooden chest and withdrew an envelope that had clearly been opened and refolded many times. "She wrote that the land would wait for me to come home, but the traditional knowledge would die if I didn't learn to value it above the success the outside world offered." Maya found herself thinking about her own grandmother, the only person who'd ever made her feel genuinely wanted. Helen Chun had died when Maya was 12, and her death had been the beginning of Maya's journey through the foster care system. But unlike Thomas, Maya had never inherited anything from her grandmother except memories, Did you come back right away? Maya asked. I fought it for 2 years. Kept telling myself that I had important work in Chicago, that I was making a difference. In the financial world, that abandoning a 6-figure salary to become a rancher would be throwing away everything I'd worked for. Thomas returned the photograph to its place on the shelf. But every night, I'd dream about this valley. I'd wake up in my downtown apartment feeling like I was suffocating, like I'd forgotten how to breathe properly. Maya understood this feeling intimately. She'd experienced it in every foster home, the sense of being in the wrong life, of playing a role that didn't fit, of slowly losing pieces of herself until she couldn't remember who she'd been before the performance began. What finally convinced you to leave Chicago? Thomas smiled, but it was an expression tinged with old pain. I had a heart attack at 35. Stress, poor diet, no exercise, no connection to anything that actually mattered. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized I was dying slowly in a life that looked successful but felt empty. Maya absorbed this revelation, understanding that Thomas's return to the valley hadn't been a simple homecoming but a kind of resurrection. And you taught yourself all this? She gestured toward the workshop full of traditional artwork. My grandmother had written detailed instructions for everything, which stones to use for specific purposes, how to prepare metals, what each symbol meant in our family's design tradition. It was like she'd anticipated that I'd need to rediscover this knowledge. Without her guidance, Thomas picked up a partially completed necklace, its silver settings waiting for turquoise stones. But learning the techniques was the easy part. Understanding why this work mattered, why preserving these traditions was worth dedicating my life. To that took years. Maya found herself studying Thomas's face as he spoke, recognizing something she'd never seen in the adults who'd controlled her life before. Thomas wasn't just successful in the conventional sense. He'd built something meaningful that reflected his values rather than other people's expectations. The ranch, the tourism business, all of this. Thomas gestured toward the windows that framed the valley beyond. It's really about creating a space where traditional knowledge and modern life can coexist, where young people like you can learn that there are different ways to build a meaningful life. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the main house. Through the workshop windows, Maya could see 2 pickup trucks and what looked like an official government vehicle pulling into the circular drive. Thomas's expression immediately shifted to something more guarded. That's probably the delegation from the tribal council, he said. They've been wanting to discuss some land development proposals. Maya sensed tension in Thomas that she'd never seen before. Is that bad? It's complicated, Thomas said, moving toward the door. There are people who think this valley should be developed differently, turned into something more commercially profitable. They see my approach as inefficient. Maya followed Thomas out of the workshop, her protective instincts suddenly activated. Over the past month, she'd come to think of the valley as sanctuary, a place where broken things could heal and lost people could find their way. The idea that outside forces might want to change or destroy what Thomas had built here triggered the same defensive response she'd felt when Kyle Williams had disrespected Thomas during his family's visit. The men getting out of the vehicles looked official and serious suits and ties that seemed out of place in the desert setting, clipboards and briefcases that suggested bureaucratic agendas. Maya recognized the type immediately. Adults who made decisions about other people's lives based on paperwork rather than understanding. Thomas, called the man leading the group, a heavy-set individual wearing a bolo tie and cowboy boots that looked expensive but unused. Hope we're not interrupting anything important. Mr. Davidson, Thomas replied, his voice polite but noticeably cooler than his usual warmth. I wasn't expecting you until next week. Change of plans. The investors are eager to move forward with the casino proposal, and we wanted to get your final answer before they start looking at alternative locations. Maya felt her stomach drop. Casino proposal? Alternative locations? No one had mentioned anything about casinos or investors, or the possibility that the valley might be sold or developed. "Maya," Thomas said quietly, "why don't you go check on the evening feeding schedule? I'll handle this." But Maya found herself rooted in place, unwilling to leave Thomas to face what was clearly a confrontational situation alone. The protective instincts that had emerged during the Williams family visit were now fully activated. "Actually," she said, surprising herself with her own boldness, "I'd like to hear about this casino proposal. If it affects the ranch, it affects my job." Davidson looked at Maya with the dismissive glance adults typically reserved for teenagers, who'd spoken out of turn. "This is a private business discussion, young lady." "Maya works here," Thomas said firmly. "She has a right to know about anything that might impact her employment." Maya felt a surge of gratitude toward Thomas for defending her inclusion in the conversation, but also growing anxiety about what she was about to learn. Davidson opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "Thomas, we've been through this before. The Sunset Valley Resort and Casino would bring hundreds of jobs to the area, millions in tax revenue, and opportunities for tribal members that don't currently exist, at the cost of destroying 12,000 acres of pristine desert and turning this valley into a commercial entertainment complex," Thomas replied. "Thomas, you're one man running a small tourism operation that serves maybe 100 guests per year. We're talking about a development that could serve thousands, that could transform the economic prospects for everyone in this region." Maya listened to this exchange with growing horror. She was beginning to understand that the sanctuary she'd found, the place where she was learning to trust and heal and build something meaningful, was under threat from people who saw it only in terms of commercial potential. "Mr. Davidson," Maya said, her voice steadier than she felt, "have you ever actually stayed here? Have you experienced what Thomas has built?" Davidson looked at her with obvious irritation. "I don't need to experience it to understand that it's not maximizing the land's economic potential." "But how do you measure potential?" Maya pressed, remembering conversations with Thomas about different ways of defining success. "Thomas helps people remember who they are underneath all the stress and distraction of modern life. How do you put a dollar value on that?" Davidson's expression shifted to barely concealed condescension. "Young lady, idealism is admirable, but it doesn't pay bills or create sustainable economic development for tribal communities." Maya felt her anger crystallizing into something more focused and articulate. "This place has completely changed my life in 4 weeks. I came here as a runaway with no future and no hope, and Thomas gave me both. How many people has your casino proposal actually helped?" Thomas placed a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder, a gesture that was both supportive and cautionary. Maya realized she was defending him with the same fierce loyalty she'd never been able to feel for any of the adults who'd claimed to care for her before. "Davidson," Thomas said quietly, "my answer hasn't changed. This land is not for sale, and it's not available for casino development. My family has been stewarding this valley for over a century, and I intend to continue that stewardship." Davidson's face reddened with obvious frustration. "Thomas, you're being short-sighted. The tribal council is prepared to offer you a very generous compensation package." "The tribal council doesn't own this land," Thomas replied. "My family's original treaty grant predates the current reservation boundaries. This valley is private property, held in trust, and it's not subject to tribal council development decisions." Maya watched this exchange with fascination and terror. She was learning that Thomas's ownership of the valley was more complex than simple possession, that it involved legal and cultural considerations she'd never encountered before. As the delegation prepared to leave, Davidson turned back to Thomas with obvious reluctance. "We'll be back next month with a revised proposal. I hope you'll reconsider." After the vehicles disappeared down the valley road, Maya and Thomas stood in silence, watching dust settle in the afternoon light. Are they going to keep pressuring you? Maya asked. Thomas nodded grimly. As long as there's money to be made, there will be pressure to develop this land in ways that prioritize profit over preservation. Maya felt fear creeping back into her chest, not fear for her own safety, but fear of losing the first place that had ever felt like home. What happens if they find a way to force you to sell? Thomas looked at Maya with an expression that mixed determination with uncertainty. Then we'll have to be more creative about protecting what we've built here. That evening, as Maya helped, Thomas prepared dinner in comfortable silence. She realized that her investment in the valley's future had become personal in ways she'd never expected. She wasn't just afraid of losing her job or her home. She was afraid of losing the first place where she discovered that she might be capable of more than just survival. For the first time since arriving in the valley, Maya went to bed thinking, not just about her own healing, but about how she might help protect the sanctuary that was making that healing possible. The Arizona Department of Child Services van pulled into the valley on a Thursday morning when Maya had been there exactly 6 weeks. She spotted it from the horse pasture where she was working with Luna on lead training, the white government vehicle crawling up the dusty access road like a predator that had finally found her scent. Maya's first instinct was to run, drop everything, and disappear into the network of canyons and arroyos that Thomas had been teaching her to navigate. She knew every hiding spot within 5 miles now, every cave and overhang where someone could wait out a search. But something had changed in her during those 6 weeks, something that made running feel like abandoning rather than escaping. The caseworker who emerged from the van was a woman Maya had never seen before, which was both good and bad news. Good because it meant Linda Morrison hadn't sent someone who knew Maya's history of flight attempts. Bad because it meant starting over with explanations and justifications to someone who would evaluate her situation through the lens of policy and procedure rather than understanding. Thomas appeared from the main house, moving with the calm authority Maya had come to associate with his handling of difficult situations. He spoke briefly with the caseworker before gesturing toward the pasture where Maya stood frozen beside Luna, still holding the lead rope in hands that had begun to shake. "Maya-chan?" the caseworker called, approaching the fence line. "I'm Jennifer Sullivan from Arizona Department of Child Services. I need to speak with you about your current living situation." Maya's mouth went dry. She'd known this moment would come. Eventually had known that the state wouldn't simply lose track of her because she'd found somewhere safe to land. But 6 weeks of peace had almost convinced her that she might be allowed to disappear into the life she was building here. "How did you find me?" Maya asked, making no move to approach the fence. "Your foster mother reported you missing 6 weeks ago. We've been tracking credit card usage, interviewing truckers who might have given you rides, checking with relatives. A highway patrol officer remembered seeing someone matching your description near a broken-down Honda Civic." Jennifer Sullivan consulted her tablet. "Mr. Beay called our office yesterday to report that he's been providing you with shelter and employment." Maya's head snapped toward Thomas with something approaching betrayal. He'd called them? After everything he'd said about giving her space to make her own choices, he'd contacted the authorities without telling her. Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Maya, you're still legally a minor. I couldn't continue housing you without going through proper channels, but calling them doesn't mean sending you away. It means making your presence here official and legal." Jennifer Sullivan opened a folder thick with documents. "Maya, you're classified as a runaway, which means we need to evaluate your current placement for safety and appropriateness. Mr. Beay has applied to become your legal guardian until you turn 18. The world seemed to tilt around Maya. Legal guardian? Thomas had been planning to formally adopt her without discussing it with her first. The same panic that had driven her from Phoenix began rising in her chest. Adults making decisions about her life, controlling her future, pretending they knew what was best for her. Nobody asked me what I wanted, Maya said, her voice tight with rising anger. That's why I'm here, Jennifer Sullivan said. To ask you what you want. Maya looked between Thomas and the caseworker, feeling trapped between impossible choices. Stay and submit to another adult's control over her life, or run and lose the first place that had ever felt like home. What happens if I say I want to stay here? Maya asked. Mr. Beay would need to complete guardian training, submit to regular home inspections, and provide documentation that he can support you financially and emotionally until you reach majority age. And if I say I want to leave, we'd need to find you another placement. There's a group home in Flagstaff that specializes in older teens who are preparing for independence. Maya felt Luna nudging her shoulder, the horse responding to her elevated stress with gentle contact. The simple gesture reminded Maya of how much she'd learned about communication and trust over the past 6 weeks. How different her life had become since Thomas had offered her sanctuary without conditions or expectations. Can I have some time to think about it? Maya asked. Of course. But Maya, I need you to understand that running away again isn't an option. If you leave here without going through proper channels, you'll be classified as a chronic runaway, which significantly limits your placement options. After Jennifer Sullivan left with promises to return the following week for Maya's decision, Thomas and Maya found themselves alone in the valley's vast silence. Maya had turned Luna out to pasture and was sitting on the fence rail, staring at the horizon with an expression Thomas had learned to recognize as her processing mode. You're angry with me, Thomas said, settling onto the rail beside her. You made decisions about my life without asking me, Maya replied. You applied to be my guardian like I was a stray dog you decided to keep. Thomas nodded, accepting the accuracy of her assessment. You're right. I should have discussed it with you before contacting Child Services. But Maya, I was trying to protect what we've built here, not control your choices. How is applying for guardianship protecting anything? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching cattle move across the distant pasture in the unhurried way of animals who knew their territory was safe. Because there are people who want to use your presence here against me, he said finally. Davidson and his investors have been looking for any excuse to question my judgment, to suggest that I'm not a responsible steward of this land. An unofficial arrangement with a runaway minor gives them ammunition to claim I'm reckless or inappropriate. Maya felt her anger shifting toward understanding. Thomas wasn't trying to possess her. He was trying to legitimize her place in the valley so that no one could use their relationship to threaten what he'd built. What kind of ammunition? Maya asked. They could claim I'm exploiting underage labor, housing a minor without proper oversight, creating liability issues for the tourism business. Any of those accusations would trigger investigations that could shut down everything we're doing here. Maya realized that Thomas's decision to involve Child Services had been strategic rather than controlling, a way of ensuring that her presence in the valley was legally protected rather than vulnerable to attack. So becoming my legal guardian is really about protecting the ranch? Maya asked. It's about protecting you and the ranch, Thomas corrected. Maya, these past 6 weeks have been some of the best this place has seen. You've brought something special here, a perspective, an energy, a way of connecting with people that complements what I'm trying to build. Maya found herself studying Thomas's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine appreciation and respect. What if I'm not ready for another adult to have legal control over my life? Maya asked. Then we figure out alternatives, Thomas said simply. Maybe we explore emancipation procedures, or we find a different way to legitimize your status here. Maya, the goal isn't to control your choices. The goal is to create a framework where you can stay if you want to stay. Maya slipped down from the fence rail and walked toward the house, needing space to process everything she'd learned. Thomas didn't follow. respecting her need for solitude in the way she'd come to expect from him. That evening, Maya found herself in the workshop again, surrounded by generations of artistic tradition and cultural preservation. She picked up the bracelet Thomas had shown her that morning, studying the intricate patterns that told stories she was only beginning to understand. For the first time in her life, Maya was being offered the chance to choose her own future rather than simply accepting whatever placement adults decided was convenient. But the choice came with complications she'd never had to consider before: legal frameworks, government oversight, the possibility that her decision might affect Thomas's ability to continue his work. Maya Chun had spent 17 years learning to survive other people's choices about her life. Now she had to learn something infinitely more difficult: how to make choices about her own future that considered not just her survival, but her capacity for contributing to something larger than herself. The bracelet caught the workshop's light and threw it back in complex patterns, just like the valley itself, beautiful and intricate and worth protecting, but requiring courage and commitment to preserve. Maya was beginning to understand that some things were worth the risk of staying, even when staying meant trusting adults with power over her life. The question was whether she'd developed enough courage to choose vulnerability over the safety of perpetual motion. Outside the workshop windows, the valley stretched toward mountains that glowed purple in the evening light, vast and patient, and full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Maya's decision came not in a moment of dramatic clarity, but during the quiet hour before dawn on the day Jennifer Sullivan was scheduled to return. She'd been lying in bed, listening to the coyotes sing their ancient songs across the valley, when she realized that leaving would mean abandoning not just her own healing, but her responsibility to protect what Thomas had built. The past week had brought revelations that changed everything Maya thought she understood about her place in the valley. Thomas had shown her the legal documents that proved his family's ownership of the land. Treaties dating back to 1868, property deeds accumulated over generations, water rights that made the valley's development impossible without his consent. But he'd also shown her the pressure he was under from forces much larger than Mr. Davidson's casino proposal. "There's something you need to understand about why they want this land so badly," Thomas had said 3 days earlier, spreading maps across his kitchen table that showed the valley's position relative to major highways, cities, and other tribal lands. Maya studied the maps, recognizing the valley's strategic location for the first time. They were positioned almost exactly between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, with direct access to Interstate 40 and proximity to several major tourist destinations. "The casino is just the beginning," Thomas explained. "Once they establish commercial development here, they'll push for expanded gambling facilities, hotels, shopping centers, maybe even an airport. This valley would become the center of a massive entertainment complex." "Is that necessarily bad?" Maya asked. "I mean, wouldn't it bring jobs and money to tribal communities?" Thomas looked at Maya with the expression he wore when he was about to share something particularly important. "Maya, there are different kinds of wealth. The kind Davidson is promising would make some people rich, but it would destroy something irreplaceable." He gestured toward the windows where the morning light was painting the red rocks in shades of gold and orange. "This valley is one of the last places in Arizona where traditional ways of life can still be practiced without interference. The plants here, the water sources, the animal migration patterns, they're all connected in ways that took thousands of years to develop." Maya found herself thinking about the changes she'd witnessed in herself over the past 6 weeks, how the valley's rhythms had gradually replaced the constant anxiety that had characterized her life in Phoenix. "More than that," Thomas continued, "this place serves as a sanctuary for people who need space to remember who they are underneath all the noise and pressure of modern life. Development would destroy that possibility forever." Maya absorbed this information, beginning to understand that her choice about staying or leaving was connected to much larger questions about cultural preservation, environmental protection, and the rights of indigenous communities to control their own destinies. But the week had also brought unexpected support that gave Maya hope about the valley's future. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived on Tuesday morning, driving a dust-covered Subaru that looked like it had seen more backcountry adventures than most people experienced in a lifetime. She was a cultural anthropologist from Northern Arizona University, conducting research on traditional land stewardship practices and their effectiveness compared to conventional development models. "Mr. Beay," Dr. Rodriguez said as Thomas showed her around the property, "your integration of traditional practices with sustainable tourism is exactly what we're trying to document and preserve." Maya listened from her position grooming horses near the barn, fascinated by Dr. Rodriguez's academic perspective on what she'd been experiencing as simply healing and belonging. "The data we're collecting suggests that cultural tourism focused on authentic education and environmental connection produces more sustainable economic benefits than commercial gaming operations," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Communities that prioritize cultural preservation tend to maintain stronger social cohesion and better long-term outcomes for young people." Maya realized that Dr. Rodriguez was describing in scientific terms what she'd observed personally, that the valley's approach to helping people heal and connect was more effective than the quick fixes and band-aid solutions she'd encountered in the foster care system. "Would you be willing to participate in our study?" Dr. Rodriguez asked Thomas. "We're documenting traditional knowledge preservation efforts and their impact on community resilience." Maya watched Thomas consider this request, recognizing his careful evaluation of whether academic attention would help or hurt his ability to protect the valley. "What would participation involve?" Thomas asked. "Interviews, documentation of your traditional practices, economic analysis of your tourism model, and long-term tracking of environmental and social outcomes. The research would provide scientific support for community-controlled development approaches." Maya understood that Dr. Rodriguez was offering Thomas something valuable: academic legitimacy that could counter the casino developers' claims about economic efficiency and community benefit. That afternoon, Dr. Rodriguez interviewed Maya about her experience in the valley, asking questions that forced Maya to articulate changes she'd felt but hadn't fully analyzed. "Describe your daily routine before coming here versus your current routine," Dr. Rodriguez said, taking notes on a tablet while they sat in the shade of an ancient cottonwood tree. Maya thought about her life in Phoenix, the careful navigation of Linda Morrison's moods, the hypervigilance required to avoid triggering conflicts, the exhausting performance of gratitude for care that felt conditional and temporary. "Before, I spent most of my energy trying to anticipate what other people wanted from me and figuring out how to provide it without losing too much of myself in the process," Maya said. "Here, I spend my energy learning skills that actually matter and taking care of things that depend on me." "Can you be more specific about the skills you've learned?" Maya looked toward the pasture where Luna was grazing, then at the mountains that had become familiar landmarks, then at Thomas, who was working in his garden with the focused attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Horse training, land navigation, weather reading, plant identification, basic veterinary care, but also—" Maya paused, trying to articulate something more subtle. "I've learned how to be still without being inactive, how to contribute to something larger than myself, how to trust my own judgment about people and situations." Dr. Rodriguez made extensive notes. "And how has this environment supported those changes?" Maya considered the question seriously. "Thomas doesn't try to fix me or change me. He just gives me opportunities to discover what I'm capable of when I'm not spending all my energy on defense mechanisms. The work here is real. If I don't feed the horses properly, they suffer. If I don't maintain the fences, the cattle get out. There are consequences, but they're natural consequences related to actual responsibilities, not arbitrary punishment based on adult mood swings. Have you experienced this kind of stability before? Never, Maya said honestly. Every foster placement came with rules that changed depending on the family's stress level and expectations that I had no control over meeting. Here, the expectations are clear and they're connected to outcomes that actually matter. Dr. Rodriguez's interview lasted 2 hours and covered everything from Maya's educational background to her plans for the future. By the end, Maya felt like she'd been through therapy, academic evaluation, and job interview simultaneously. But the most significant conversation came that evening when Jennifer Sullivan returned for Maya's final decision about the guardianship arrangement. They met in Thomas's living room, a space that had become as familiar to Maya as any room she'd ever inhabited. Thomas had lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and the dancing flames cast warm shadows on walls decorated with traditional weavings and family photographs. Maya, Jennifer Sullivan began, I've completed my evaluation of this placement, and I need to share my findings with you. Maya braced herself for the inevitable litany of concerns about unorthodox living arrangements, inadequate supervision, or inappropriate boundaries between guardian and ward. Instead, Jennifer Sullivan said, This is the most impressive alternative placement I've encountered in 15 years of social work. Maya stared at her, uncertain she'd heard correctly. Mr. Beay has created a structured environment that addresses all the risk factors typically associated with aging out of foster care. You have stable housing, meaningful employment, educational opportunities, and most importantly, a relationship with an adult who seems genuinely invested in your long-term success rather than short-term compliance. Maya felt tears threatening. Not from sadness, but from relief so profound it was almost overwhelming. More than that, Jennifer Sullivan continued, you've shown more positive behavioral changes in 6 weeks here than most teens show in years of traditional placements. Your body language, communication skills, and apparent sense of security are remarkable. Thomas had remained quietly throughout the evaluation, letting Maya's own words and the caseworker's professional judgment speak for the quality of what they'd built together. Maya, Jennifer Sullivan said, the guardianship paperwork is ready for your signature if you choose to proceed. But I want you to understand what you're agreeing to. She outlined the legal framework that would govern Maya's remaining months as a minor regular check-ins with child services, educational requirements that could be met through online coursework or GED preparation, and the understanding that Thomas would be legally responsible for her welfare until she turned 18. The alternative, Jennifer Sullivan said, is returning to traditional foster care for your remaining 4 months. I won't lie to you, placements for 17-year-olds are limited, and they're typically focused on basic maintenance rather than personal development. Maya looked at Thomas, studying his face for any sign that he was accepting guardianship out of obligation, rather than genuine desire to continue their relationship. Thomas, she said, if I sign this paperwork, what changes? Nothing changes in terms of how we interact or what's expected of you, Thomas replied. The only difference is that your presence here becomes official and protected. No one can use our relationship to attack the ranch or question your right to be here. Maya understood that Thomas was offering her something unprecedented in her. Experience legal security without emotional manipulation, official status without loss of personal autonomy. What about after I turn 18? Maya asked. What happens to this arrangement when I'm legally an adult? Thomas smiled. Then you get to choose what comes next without anyone having legal authority over your decisions. You can stay here as an employee and partner in the ranch operations, or you can use what you've learned here as a foundation for whatever other life you want to build. Maya realized that Thomas was offering her something even more valuable than immediate sanctuary. He was offering her the time and support to discover what she actually wanted rather than simply accepting whatever options other people provided. I "Want to stay," Maya said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I want to sign the guardianship papers." Jennifer Sullivan smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. This placement is going to be a model for other programs across the state." As they completed the paperwork that would make Maya's presence in the Fayas Valley official and legal, Maya found herself thinking about the girl who'd hidden in Thomas's barn 6 weeks earlier. That girl had been running from everything, convinced that she was too damaged for anyone to want her permanently. The young woman signing guardianship documents was someone different, someone who'd learned that healing happened not through isolation, but through the courage to contribute meaningfully to something worth protecting. When Jennifer Sullivan left with promises to return for quarterly check-ins, Maya and Thomas stood on the front porch watching government taillights disappear into the desert darkness. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked. Maya looked out across the valley that was now officially her home, at the stars that shone more brightly here than anywhere she'd ever lived, at the landscape that had taught her to measure success in terms of growth, rather than just survival. "Just one," Maya said. "I wish I'd found this place sooner." Thomas smiled. "Maya, you found it exactly when you were ready to find it. And more importantly, it found you." Maya Chun had spent 17 years believing that permanence was a luxury reserved for other people's children. Tonight, for the first time in her life, she was going to sleep in a place where she had the legal right to stay, surrounded by people who valued her presence rather than merely tolerating it. It was more than enough. It was everything she'd never allowed herself to hope for. Maya's 18th birthday arrived with the first snow of the season, transforming the valley into something that looked like the landscape of dreams. She woke to find her window frosted with ice crystals that caught the morning light and threw it back in rainbow fragments. And for a moment she lay still, marveling at the fact that she was waking up in the same bed for the 78th consecutive. The stability she was learning was both gift and responsibility. Thomas had been planning something special for her birthday, she could tell, from his careful questions about her favorite foods and the mysterious packages that had been arriving by mail over the past 2 weeks. But Maya's own plans were more ambitious than any celebration he might have organized. Over the past month, as autumn had painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Maya had been working on a project that represented everything she'd learned about courage, commitment, and the importance of protecting things worth preserving. She'd been secretly learning silversmith every evening after the ranch work was complete and Thomas had retired to his own projects. Maya had been slipping into the workshop to practice the techniques she'd observed him using. She'd started with simple wire-bending exercises, progressing to basic metalwork, and finally attempting the complex pattern work that characterized his family's traditional designs. The bracelet she'd been creating was intended as more than a birthday gift to herself. It was proof that she could learn to create rather than simply survive, that she could contribute to the cultural preservation work that made the valley special, that she belonged here not just as a recipient of Thomas's generosity, but as a partner in continuing his family's legacy. But when Maya entered the workshop that morning, she found Thomas sitting at his workbench, examining her hidden project, with an expression that mixed surprise, concern, and something that might have been pride. "Maya," he said quietly, "we need to talk about this." Maya's chest tightened with familiar fear. Had she overstepped some boundary? Violated some cultural protocol she didn't understand? Presumed to participate in traditions that weren't meant for her? "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know I should have asked permission before using your materials. I'll pay you back for everything I used." Thomas looked up at her with gentle confusion. "Maya, I'm not upset about the materials. I'm concerned about the spiritual significance of what you're attempting to create." Maya moved closer to examine her work through Thomas's eyes. The bracelet incorporated traditional dyeing patterns she'd copied from his grandmother's designs, but she'd added elements of her own small copper accents that represented the desert sunrise turquoise stones, arranged to mirror the constellation patterns she'd learned to recognize during night watches with the cattle. "This design," Thomas said, pointing to the section Maya was most proud of, "is traditionally used to mark someone's formal acceptance into the clan. It's not just decorative metalwork, it's a spiritual commitment that connects the wearer to generations of ancestors and to specific responsibilities within the community." Maya felt her face burning with embarrassment. She'd thought she was creating art, but she'd apparently been making claims about belonging that she had no right to make. "I didn't know," Maya said. "I just wanted to make something that showed how much this place means to me." Thomas set the bracelet down carefully and turned to face Maya directly. "Maya, I'm not telling you this to discourage your interest in traditional metalwork. I'm telling you because what you've created here demonstrates understanding and skill that typically takes years to develop." Maya looked at Thomas in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The patterns you've chosen, the way you've integrated traditional designs with personal elements. This isn't the work of someone randomly copying designs they've seen. This suggests an intuitive understanding of how symbols function in our artistic tradition." Thomas picked up the bracelet again, studying Maya's work with obvious admiration. "More than that, the copper accents you've added, the constellation patterns, these are innovations that honor the traditional framework while expressing your own spiritual connection to the valley." Maya realized that Thomas wasn't criticizing her work, he was recognizing it as something more significant than she'd intended to create. "Thomas, I don't understand what you're saying." "I'm saying that you've created something that demonstrates not just technical skill, but cultural integration. You've learned to think like someone who belongs here, someone who understands their place in the larger web of relationships that connect people to land, to ancestors, to each other." Maya felt tears threatening, but these were different tears than she'd cried before, tears of recognition rather than pain, of belonging rather than loss. "Are you saying I can finish it?" Maya asked. "I'm saying we should finish it together." "But Maya, if you're going to wear symbols that carry this kind of spiritual significance, you need to understand what you're committing to." Thomas spent the next hour explaining the cultural and spiritual dimensions of traditional dine metalwork, how specific patterns carried prayers, how wearing certain symbols created obligations to community and land, how artistic creation was considered a form of ceremony that connected the maker to sacred knowledge. "In our tradition," Thomas said, "jewelry isn't just personal adornment. It's a way of carrying your responsibilities with you, of remembering who you are and what you owe to the people and places that have shaped you." Maya understood that Thomas was offering her something beyond craft instruction. He was offering her initiation into cultural knowledge that had been carefully preserved across generations. "What would I be committing to if I wear this?" Maya asked. "You'd be committing to protecting this valley and everything it represents. You'd be accepting responsibility for learning and preserving traditional knowledge. You'd be acknowledging that your healing is connected to your ability to help other people heal." Maya thought about the tourists who'd visited over the past 2 months, the way they'd arrived stressed and disconnected and left with something approaching peace. She thought about Dr. Rodriguez's research on traditional approaches to community resilience. She thought about the casino developers who wanted to destroy something irreplaceable for short-term profit. "I want to make that commitment," Maya said. "This place saved my life. I want to spend my life helping it save other people." Thomas smiled with an expression Maya had never seen before, not just pride or affection, but recognition, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Then we'll complete this bracelet together, and we'll do it properly. But first, there's someone I want you to meet." Thomas made a phone call in rapid dying that Maya couldn't understand, though she caught her own name several times. An hour later, an elderly woman arrived in a pickup truck that looked like it had been driven across every back road in Arizona. "Maya," Thomas said, This is my aunt, Agnes Beay. She's the one who taught me everything I know about traditional metalworking, and she's the keeper of our family's design knowledge. Agnes Beay was probably in her 70s with silver hair, braided down her back, and eyes that seemed to see through Maya's nervous politeness to something deeper and more essential. She examined Maya's bracelet with the focused attention of someone evaluating not just technical skill, but spiritual readiness. "This girl has good hands," Agnes said finally, speaking to Thomas in English, but clearly making an assessment intended for Maya to hear. "Good eyes, too. She sees patterns most people miss." At Agnes, Thomas said. "Maya wants to understand the full significance of what she's creating." Agnes turned her attention to Maya with an intensity that was both welcoming and challenging. "Child, why do you want to wear our family's symbols?" Maya had prepared for this question during the hour of waiting, but Agnes's directness still caught her off guard. "Because this valley has become my home, and Thomas has become my family, and I want to honor the traditions that created this place." Agnes studied Maya's face for a long moment. "And what will you do when people try to take this place away from you?" "Fight to protect it," Maya said without hesitation. "This valley has given me everything: safety, purpose, family, hope. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure other people get the same chance I got." Agnes smiled, the first time her stern expression had softened since her arrival. "Thomas, this one understands. She knows that accepting family symbols means accepting family responsibilities." They spent the evening completing Maya's bracelet under Agnes's guidance, the elder woman sharing stories about each pattern and symbol, explaining their spiritual significance and the obligations they carried. As Agnes helped Maya set the final turquoise stone, she spoke words in Dine that Thomas translated. "She's saying that you're no longer a visitor in this valley. You're a daughter of this land, with all the rights and responsibilities that relationship carries." Maya fastened the completed bracelet around her wrist, feeling the weight of silver and stone and centuries of tradition. But more than that, she felt the weight of belonging, not just to a place, but to a lineage of people who dedicated their lives to preserving something sacred. "Happy birthday, Maya," Thomas said, embracing her with the warmth of someone who'd gained a daughter rather than simply completed a guardianship arrangement. As Agnes prepared to leave, she pulled Maya aside for a private conversation that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Child," Agnes said, "Thomas has been alone too long, carrying this responsibility by himself. The valley needs young people who understand that some things are worth more than money, worth more than individual success. You've found your place here, but more importantly, this place has found its future in you." Maya understood that Agnes was speaking not just about cultural preservation, but about the continuation of something larger, a way of life that honored both tradition and innovation, that created space for healing without abandoning the wisdom of ancestors. That night, Maya stood at her bedroom window, watching snow fall across the valley in the blue darkness, wearing a bracelet that declared her commitment to protecting everything spread out before her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't planning her next escape route. Instead, she was planning how to ensure that the sanctuary that had saved her would be available to save others who needed exactly what she'd found in Thomas Beay's valley. Confrontation that would determine the valley's future came on a crisp March morning, exactly 1 year after Maya had first hidden in Thomas's barn. She was leading a group of environmental science students from the University of Arizona on a dawn wildlife observation tour when she spotted the convoy of vehicles approaching from the south, black SUVs that looked out of place against the desert landscape, moving with the purposeful urgency of people who intended to impose their will regardless of local preferences. Maya counted 8 vehicles, more than had ever visited the valley simultaneously. Through her binoculars, she could see men in expensive suits getting out of cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries, accompanied by others who looked like lawyers or government officials. "Professor Chun," called one of her students. a young man named David who'd been documenting plant biodiversity for his senior thesis. Are those vehicles part of our scheduled activities? Maya lowered her binoculars, recognizing that the peaceful morning she'd planned was about to become something much more significant. No, David, I think we're about to witness a confrontation that's been building for months. She made a quick decision that surprised her with its clarity. Instead of sending the students away to protect them from potential conflict, Maya led them toward the main house where she could see Thomas emerging to meet the uninvited delegation. This is exactly the kind of real-world environmental politics you're studying in your coursework, Maya told the students. You're about to see how land use decisions get made when conservation and commercial development interests collide. Maya had spent the past year learning that education could be a form of activism, that bearing witness to important moments could be as powerful as direct intervention. The man leading the delegation was someone Maya had never seen before. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Maya had earned in her entire year at the ranch. He carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and financial pressure. Thomas Beay, the man called out as they approached the house. I'm Marcus Steinberg, representing Sunset Horizon Development Corporation. I believe you've been expecting us. Thomas emerged fully from the house, and Maya could see him mentally preparing for the confrontation he'd known was inevitable. But what surprised her was his calm demeanor, not the resigned acceptance of someone facing superior force, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Mr. Steinberg, Thomas replied, I told your representatives that this land is not available for casino development. I'm not sure what additional conversation you think we need to have. Steinberg smiled with the practiced insincerity Maya had. Learn to recognize in adults who used friendliness as a weapon. Thomas, we're not here to pressure you. We're here to help you understand the magnitude of opportunity you're turning down. He gestured toward the valley spreading out around them, thousands of acres of pristine desert, red rock formations that looked like ancient cathedrals, mountains that rose like purple promises against the morning sky. This location could accommodate a resort complex that would rival anything in Las Vegas or Atlantic City. We're talking about bringing 15,000 jobs to rural Arizona, creating a destination that would attract millions of visitors annually, generating tax revenue that could fund schools and hospitals and infrastructure improvements across the entire region. Maya listened to Steinberg's presentation with growing understanding of the seductive power of development rhetoric. He wasn't just offering money, he was offering the promise of prosperity for entire communities, the chance to lift rural Arizona out of economic stagnation through massive commercial investment. And in exchange, Thomas said quietly, you'd destroy one of the last intact examples of traditional Dineland stewardship, eliminate habitat for dozens of endangered plant and animal species, and turn a sacred landscape into a commercial entertainment complex. Thomas, you're thinking too small, Steinberg continued. Yes, there would be environmental impacts, but we're committed to mitigation measures and sustainable development practices. The economic benefits far outweigh the environmental costs. Maya felt her anger building, but she forced herself to remain silent and observant. This was Thomas's fight, and she was here to support him rather than lead the opposition. Mr. Steinberg, Thomas said, you're assuming that economic development is inherently more valuable than cultural preservation and environmental protection. That assumption reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how indigenous communities define prosperity. Steinberg's polished facade began to crack slightly. Thomas, be realistic. You're one man running a small-scale operation that serves a handful of tourists each year. We're offering you the chance to participate in development that would benefit thousands of people at the cost of destroying something irreplaceable, Thomas replied. Some things are more valuable than their potential commercial applications. Maya realized that this conversation was about more than land use. It was about fundamentally different philosophies of what constituted progress, what defined success, what responsibilities people had to preserve rather than simply exploit. Natural resources. But Steinberg wasn't finished with his presentation. He withdrew a folder from his briefcase and handed it to Thomas with obvious ceremony. Thomas, this is a formal purchase offer from Sunset Horizon Development. $25 million for the entire valley, with the understanding that you could remain as a cultural consultant for the resort's Native American education programs. Maya watched Thomas examine the documents with no change in his calm expression. $25 million was more money than Maya could conceptualize. Enough to buy security and comfort beyond anything she'd ever imagined possible. Mr. Steinberg, Thomas said, handing the folder back without opening it fully, you could offer $50 million, and my answer would remain the same. This land is not for sale at any price. Steinberg's mask of friendly persuasion finally slipped entirely. Thomas, you're being unreasonable. This development is going to happen with or without your cooperation. If you refuse to sell, we'll find ways to make your operation here economically unsustainable. Maya felt her protective instincts flare at the implied threat. But before she could respond, Thomas stepped forward with an expression that transformed his usually gentle demeanor into something more formidable. Mr. Steinberg, Thomas said, his voice carrying a steel Maya had never heard before, I suggest you research the legal status of this land more carefully before making threats. My family's treaty rights predate Arizona statehood, and they're protected by federal law. Treaties can be challenged, Steinberg said. Ownership can be disputed. Environmental regulations can be changed. There are many ways to encourage cooperation from reluctant landowners. Maya realized that Steinberg was no longer trying to persuade Thomas. He was attempting to intimidate him into compliance through implied legal and economic pressure. Is that a threat? Maya asked, stepping forward to stand beside Thomas. Steinberg looked at Maya with obvious dismissal. And you are? Maya Chun, I live here, I work here, and I have legal standing to be part of this conversation. Maya felt Thomas's surprised glance, but she kept her attention focused on Steinberg. Mr. Steinberg, you're threatening to destroy a place that serves as sanctuary for people recovering from trauma, that preserves traditional knowledge and practices, that demonstrate successful models of sustainable land stewardship. Why? Because sentiment doesn't create jobs, Steinberg replied. Because cultural preservation doesn't generate tax revenue. Because the greatest good for the greatest number sometimes requires difficult choices about resource allocation. Maya found herself thinking about all the conversations she'd had with Thomas, about different ways of measuring value, about the importance of preserving things that couldn't be quantified in purely economic terms. Mr. Steinberg, Maya said, have you ever considered that maybe your definition of greatest good is too narrow? That maybe there are benefits to preserving places like this that can't be measured in jobs and tax revenue, such as? Maya gestured toward the university students who were quietly documenting this exchange, recognizing its significance for their environmental studies research. Proof that traditional land management practices work better than industrial development. For long-term sustainability, examples of how indigenous wisdom can solve modern problems. Models for helping people reconnect with natural systems that support both individual and community health. She paused, drawing on everything she'd learned during her year in the valley. Mr. Steinberg, this valley has taught me that healing happens in relationship to land, to community, to traditional knowledge that connects us to something larger than individual success. Your casino would destroy all of that to create entertainment. For people who want to escape from their real lives, rather than learning to live them more authentically. Steinberg looked at Maya with something approaching respect, apparently recognizing that she wasn't just an emotional teenager defending her adopted home, but someone who developed sophisticated understanding of the issues at stake. Ms. Chun, Steinberg said, you're clearly intelligent and passionate. Those are qualities that could serve you well in many different careers. Sunset Horizon would be happy to offer you a position in our cultural education programs, with benefits and advancement. Opportunities that would far exceed anything available here. Maya felt the seductive pull of Steinberg's offer: financial security, professional advancement, the chance to build a conventional career that would provide independence and status. 6 months ago, she would have been tempted by the possibility of escaping into someone else's definition of success. Mr. Steinberg, Maya said, I appreciate the offer, but I've learned something important this year. There's a difference between building a career and building a life. This valley has taught me the difference. Thomas looked at Maya with obvious pride, but Maya realized that her rejection of Steinberg's offer was about more than loyalty to Thomas or attachment to the valley. It was about understanding that some things were worth more than their commercial value, that preservation could be more important than progress, that belonging was more valuable than advancement. As the delegation prepared to leave, Steinberg made one final attempt at persuasion. Thomas, Maya, this offer won't remain available indefinitely. Market conditions change, investor interest shifts. Opportunities like this don't come along often in rural Arizona. Mr. Steinberg, Maya said, opportunities like this valley don't come along often anywhere. That's exactly why it needs to be protected rather than developed. After the vehicles disappeared down the valley road, Maya and Thomas stood in silence, watching dust settle in the morning light. The university students approached with obvious excitement about what they'd witnessed, asking questions about treaty rights and traditional land management and the politics of indigenous sovereignty. But Maya found herself thinking about a different kind of victory, not the dramatic triumph of good over evil, but the quiet success of choosing values over convenience, commitment over escape, protection over profit. Thomas, Maya said as they walked back toward the house, I understand now why your grandmother left you this valley. What do you understand? She wasn't just giving you land. She was giving you the responsibility to prove that traditional ways of life could survive in the modern world. She was trusting you to protect something irreplaceable. Thomas smiled. And now you're part of that responsibility. Maya looked out across the valley that had become her world. The pastures where horses grazed in contentment, the workshops where traditional knowledge was being preserved and shared, the guest facilities where people came to remember what they'd forgotten about living authentically. Thomas, Maya said, I want to expand the education programs. I want to bring more students here, more researchers, more people who can document and support what we're doing. I want to make this place so valuable for cultural and environmental education that no developer could ever threaten it again. Thomas looked at Maya with the expression of someone seeing his own dreams reflected and expanded in another person's vision. Maya Chun, he said, I think you're ready to start planning the valley's next 100 years. Maya realized that the scared girl who'd hidden in his barn had been replaced by someone capable of protecting what she loved, of building rather than just surviving, of ensuring that the sanctuary that had saved her would continue saving others. Long after she was gone, the cracked mirror she'd left behind in Phoenix was a memory now, replaced by the clear reflection she saw in the valley streams, someone whole, someone useful, someone home. It was everything she'd never dared to hope for, and it was just the beginning of what she and Thomas would build together in the years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.